At first it seemed perfect, intense, vulnerable, someone who made you feel chosen like never before. Then why do you live with constant tension now? Why do you analyze every message looking for what you did wrong? And at what point did loving start feeling like surviving? There is something even more unsettling. The most destructive relationships don't start with shouting, but with charm. Stay until the end, because understanding this pattern can prevent you from losing something more important than the relationship, yourself. It all starts in a way that seems almost perfect. She is intense, attentive, deeply interested in you. She listens to you like no one had before, and the connection moves quickly. You feel that finally someone sees parts of you that others never noticed. That feeling of being chosen lowers your defenses without you noticing. And that's where the first invisible step occurs. You start opening your natural boundaries. You share more, you adapt more, you give more. Not because they ask you directly, but because the bond feels special. The fast pace of the relationship seems like a sign of authenticity, not a warning. At first, any small conflict is interpreted as something normal. Even when something makes you uncomfortable, you ignore it because the overall balance still feels positive. You think that all relationships require adjustments, and you give in a little more. Without realizing it, the emotional center of gravity begins to shift. You start prioritizing her well-being over your own. You adjust schedules, change habits, modify ways of communicating to maintain harmony. Nothing seems serious on its own, but together it creates a new dynamic. You adapt, she defines the pace. There is no chaos or big problems yet, just a subtle feeling of constant effort to keep the connection intact. And that effort is precisely what opens the door to the next step. Because the real wear and tear doesn't appear all at once. It arrives slowly, almost in silence, accompanied by an emotion that is hard to identify at first. Confusion. The change is not abrupt. That's why it is so difficult to detect. Small moments start where you feel insecure without knowing exactly why. Comments that seem harmless but leave you thinking for hours. Conversations that end with a strange feeling, as if you had done something wrong, even though you can't point out what. Confusion becomes part of the routine. You start mentally reviewing what you said, how you said it, if you could have reacted better. Little by little, your energy shifts toward trying to avoid conflicts before they appear. You speak more carefully. You think more before expressing disagreement, and almost without realizing it, you start apologizing more frequently. Not because you are guilty of something clear, but because saying sorry seems like the fastest way to regain calm. Every time you do, the tense moment disappears, at least temporarily. That reinforces the pattern. Meanwhile, your perception of the relationship starts to change. It no longer feels as spontaneous as before. There is a kind of constant internal vigilance, a need to maintain emotional balance. The most dangerous thing is that you still believe all this is normal, that you are simply learning to love better, to be more patient, more understanding. But the reality is different. Your emotional world starts revolving around avoiding conflict instead of living the relationship. And when confusion mixes with the fear of losing what seemed perfect at first, the next step of the pattern appears, the toxic cycle. A constant movement between moments of intense closeness and phases of distance or emotional punishment that leave you trying to regain what you once felt. The cycle begins almost without you noticing. After a tense moment, days arrive where everything feels incredible again. She is affectionate, close, intense as in the beginning. That closeness reminds you why you fell in love and makes you think everything is improving. That phase of idealization reinforces your hope. But when you relax, something changes again. Distance, coldness, or subtle criticism appears. There isn't always a clear reason. You just feel the emotional climate change and you wonder again what you did wrong. Then you do what has already become automatic. You try to recover the connection. You try harder, explain more, give in more. You seek to return to that initial state where everything was easy. Without realizing it, your behavior starts being guided by the fear of losing those good moments. That is the core of the cycle. Idealization, tension, attempt at repair, and then idealization again. Each turn of the cycle hooks you more because the emotional contrast is strong. The positive moments feel intense precisely because they come after the discomfort, and that makes you ignore signs that would have been alarming before. Control doesn't appear as a direct order. It arises through your own need to return to calm. You start modifying yourself to avoid the negative phase, and in that attempt, you give up more internal space. The dangerous thing is that the focus is no longer on what you need, but on how to keep the relationship stable. And while the cycle repeats, something starts to happen outside the relationship, inside your own body. Because living in constant tension has a real price. Your system starts reacting as if it were always on alert. When emotional tension becomes constant, the body starts to notice it even before the mind. You sleep worse. You overthink. You feel tired even though you don't understand exactly why. Your nervous system remains on alert, waiting for the next mood swing or the next conflict. You no longer fully relax. You start anticipating reactions. You check the tone of messages, analyze silences, try to interpret small signals to avoid problems. That continuous vigilance exhausts your mental energy. And little by little, something deeper appears. The loss of identity. The decisions you used to make naturally are now filtered through an automatic question. Will this cause tension? You adjust behaviors, opinions, and even your emotions to maintain stability. Without realizing it, you stop living from who you are and start living from what avoids conflict. The body responds to that state with anxiety, fatigue, and a constant feeling of walking on eggshells. Even when everything seems to be fine, a part of you remains prepared for the next change. And that prolonged adaptation has a silent effect. You stop recognizing your own boundaries. What you would have said no to before, you now accept to avoid arguments. What used to make you uncomfortable, you now justify. You convince yourself it's temporary, that everything will balance out again. But balance doesn't arrive on its own. A moment inevitably comes when something inside gets tired of giving in. A moment where the need to say no appears. And that moment completely changes the dynamic. Because when boundaries appear, the toxic system reacts. A point comes where exhaustion weighs more than the fear of conflict. Maybe it's not a big decision, just a small moment. You say no to something you would have accepted before, you express discomfort, or you simply decide to protect your emotional space. And then something revealing happens. The reaction is not what you expected. When you start setting boundaries, the balance that maintained the dynamic changes. What seemed to work before stops working. Distance, frustration, or attempts to make you feel guilty for changing your attitude may appear. That moment is crucial because it reveals how the relationship really works. If your boundaries generate immediate tension, it means the system depended on you constantly giving in. And when you stop doing it, the whole structure shifts. Many people back down here. The fear of losing their relationship makes them give in again, because setting boundaries can feel selfish when you've been adapting for a long time. But in reality, boundaries are not an aggression. They are a way to protect your stability. Saying no doesn't mean stopping loving. It means stopping disappearing within the relationship. However, establishing boundaries doesn't always bring immediate peace. Sometimes it intensifies the conflict temporarily because it breaks the usual pattern. And there an important choice appears. Keep reacting emotionally, entering into constant arguments and justifications. Or completely change the way you participate in the game. Because real change doesn't happen just when you say no. It happens when you stop reacting automatically. And that step marks the beginning of breaking the cycle. The most powerful change isn't arguing better or finding the perfect argument. It's stopping reacting in the way the cycle expects of you. For a long time, every tension generated the same response. Explaining, justifying, trying to fix it immediately. That reaction kept the game active. The more you tried to calm the conflict, the more energy you gave to the dynamic. Breaking the cycle means something different. It means stopping before you respond. Not automatically getting defensive, not trying to convince or correct every wrong perception. You start choosing when to speak and when to simply stay calm. At first it feels strange, even uncomfortable, because reacting was a way of feeling that you still had control. But in reality, that impulse kept you trapped. When you stop feeding the emotional drama, the intensity starts to drop. Not because the other person necessarily changes, but because you no longer participate the same way. You start observing instead of absorbing, listening without assuming immediate responsibility for every external emotion. That creates internal space. And in that space, clarity appears. You start seeing the relationship as it is, not as you hope it will be again. You recognize patterns that before seemed like confusion, and you realize something important. You cannot save a dynamic by sacrificing your own stability. Stopping reacting is not coldness. It's emotional maturity. It's choosing your peace before the need to be right or to maintain something that no longer works in a healthy way. And when that clarity settles in, the final step occurs. The awakening. The moment the story stops revolving around the relationship and starts revolving around you again. The awakening doesn't happen suddenly. It comes little by little when you start looking at the whole story from a distance. You no longer analyze only what the other person did. You also observe how you entered the pattern, how you gave up parts of yourself trying to keep the relationship alive. And that understanding changes everything. Because the focus stops being on blaming and starts being on learning. You understand that no one can completely control your identity if you don't give it away bit by bit. You recognize the signs you ignored before, and you start trusting your perception again. Liberation doesn't mean leaving without pain. It means leaving with clarity. You start rebuilding your routine, your decisions, your boundaries. You reclaim spaces you had abandoned, and above all, you reclaim the feeling of being yourself without the need to constantly adapt. The relationship stops being the center of your emotional world, and then something unexpected happens. Silence no longer feels empty, it feels peaceful. The final lesson isn't avoiding all difficult relationships, it's learning to recognize when you are stopping being yourself within a dynamic. Knowing that healthy love doesn't require you to lose yourself to work. When you understand that, the pattern breaks. You no longer look for intensity confused with love. You look for stability, respect, and balance. And although the path to that clarity can be hard, it's also the beginning of a stronger and more conscious version of yourself.